So now we'll get into the third lecture here regarding the world's midnight. And this is going to be a lecture on the war of information. And we're going to talk about essentially two different types of information. We're going to talk about dogmatic or ideological information, and we're going to talk about scientific, independently verifiable field instrument information. And this is the world that humanity crests into, which we would call global modernity, which is the difficulty of discerning the truth of nature. And this is primarily a schism between religion and science. And the reason for this is we're talking about methods of inquiry or methods of understanding, which is ultimately a collision between belief, as in a story or a narrative, a system of understanding reality which is primarily based in a way of thinking which is scaffolded on nothing. It's scaffolded on hearsay. And a way of thinking which is scaffolded on multiple different independently produced, checked, and verified attempts to discern via closed, or as closed as possible, experimentation. Something that has been attempted and verified across multiple different, many different attempts at experimentation. So this is the world that modernity steps into with the thrust of science forward through prosthetic technology. Microscopes, enhanced surgical technologies. This is the depth of inquiry that's made available by technology. And this is being accelerated as we speak with artificial intelligence. This is one method of inquiry. The other method of inquiry is centuries old and is based on the hearsay of what someone said that God told them, effectively, right? And this is the world that Percy Shelley steps into in the early 1800s, and this is the world of radical declamation in which he stakes his cosmological claim from which the next 200 years unfold. And this is stated explicitly in his first major pamphlet, which gets him expelled from, let me just confirm which school. Shelley was expelled from Oxford, yes, with necessity of atheism. So this question is the question of what can be independently verified and thus proved. And so again, this is an informational question, and Shelley is standing on the cusp of the scientific revolution, everyone from Darwin to Maxwell and Boltzmann, into Einstein and Planck and Fermi. What Shelley is declaring is that there must be a real foundation upon which we base our assumptions of what is being, what is life, what is reality, and thus how we act and live. And this is directly in the face of the power structures of the church and state, which have been assembled in the centuries prior based on religious dogmatism. This is the hierarchical social structure which Shelley steps into the early 1800s of England. And this is what he explicitly disavows. He disavows the way that women are treated as property. He disavows the way that slaves are treated as property. He effectively disavows the entire British Empire and thus incurs its wrath via censorship and effectively a form of political exile. Shelley's always on the run from his creditors, on the run from his debt, and on the run ultimately from his inability to publish in a world which is hostile to his claim. And this is an epistemological claim. This is a knowledge claim. And from this knowledge claim emerges what we understand to be modern science, which is the experimental method, the scientific method, which is check, verify, test, check, verify, closed system, test, check, verify. And this is a logically rigorous way of thinking, which stands radically in the face of the belief unto death principle, which was foisted quite clearly upon the peasants of the earlier centuries and into the contemporary moments by a political elite, which is both a religious and a state elite, which fundamentally stands between the possibility of education and truth and effectively epistemological and ideological slavery to a belief system which is asserting a hierarchy of dominance through religious symbology. This is common across many different cultural strands. I'm not suggesting this is isolated to England alone. What I am suggesting is that these two epistemological modes are the question of what is knowledge and how does knowledge emerge, how is knowledge captured. And as we step into the post-Shelleyan paradigm of massive scientific revolution, massive ontological revolution in the span of 200 years of modernity that follows, we are stepping into the crisis of fragmentation that emerges from the religious ground falling out from under a locally based society, which is tribal and hierarchical, into a global, transnational based society of quickly moving information, data, and energy. Again, a thermodynamic foundation. Talking again about the oil crisis, which is just profoundly analogous to what I'm saying here. This movement of information, which has its foundations in the technological, data-based, scientific revolution, which implicates everyone from Claude Shannon to Einstein and Isaac Newton, because this is a foundation that is built on leveraging real-world physical systems to produce new modes of being, as in a prosthetic advancement of humanity through civilizational technologies. Everything from shipping to the internet to the computational device. This is a real-world application of scientific methods and modes, which creates a further fracture from this pre-technological enchanted world of belief. And this is what Shelley rails against. So this epistemological split is a cratering in, you could say, everything that emerges in the 200 years following World War I, World War II, primarily the world wars, because you can look at those wars as a clash of belief systems, right? A clash of ideologies under which the principal thermodynamic systems, physical systems operation is occurring. This is a war over physical power. This is a war over control of the Middle East. This is a war over the economic collapse of Germany. This is a war over the emerging transnational and transcontinental information, data, and energy pipelines, which is the global Silk Road that we know today. So these again, right? This collapses into our contemporary moment over the Strait of Hormuz in Iran, and the war over who controls oil, which is the primary energy pipeline of the globe. And looking at this battle, there is the ideological overstrait, or the overstrand, which is the proclamations of religious or national viability, what have you, all of which, through which the underlying energetic principles of transformation, the burning of oil, thermonuclear process of stellar production of heat and energy and elements, creating thermonuclear beings, human beings, which are consuming that energetic product and everything from plants to animals to water. These are the fundamental underlying principles. And so what you have is the emergence of the realization of how those principles function at scale, which is a universal scale. In everyone, again, from Planck to Darwin. And the elucidation of this creates a violent backlash, and I'll just call it the Copernican backlash or the Galilean backlash. It's a typical backlash of a entire civilizational body or a global body being confronted with actual physical systems level truth in the face of belief, which is highly emotional and tied to the creation of a foundation of a existential identity, nonetheless a political, cultural, communal, and familial identity. And this crisis is precisely the tectonic plate shifting friction, which produces the profound force which we see emerge in the 20th century, not only in terms of industrial revolution and technological revolution, but war. Friction of belief systems, whether you want to call those religious belief systems or national belief systems, racial belief systems, all of which are noise atop this ground that is gradually and progressively emerging. This ground, which is the actual verifiable scientific ground of existence itself, which is, in spite of what so many thought and perhaps may continue to think, is not disenchanting the world. Rather, it is a progressive re-enchantment which requires epistemological unification. This is the total Renaissance education, which is articulated and elucidated historically in Shelley, just as much as we see it in maybe in other figures such as Da Vinci. A total field education. And the emergence of this possibility is the profound friction, alienation, and fragmentation that we observe in modernity. But because the world previously was ensouled with an inadequate cosmology, or an inadequate ontos, which was adequate at the level of the local, tribal, enclosed, you could say dormant or sleeping level of being, which was very little energetic production and consumption, isolated, fragmented cultures which would occasionally go to war and trade with one another, which are being unified by this technological thermodynamic acceleration of energetic production and consumption via fossil fuels, which creates industrial technological modernity, accelerates it at a level never before seen in recorded human history, and thus opens up from this chasm of the earth, quite literally, when we're talking about fossil fuels, this chasm of the dead, latent earth, this oil product, this massive transformative possibility, which shakes and rattles the existential condition of what it is to be human and who is the human being down to its core, and reveals it to be empty and void and based on a story or a narrative, which science is progressively dissembling down to the very fabric of what is energy itself and what is the total cosmological unity between man, the thoughts of man, the most innermost state of man, and the most absolute fundamental cosmological thermonuclear creation of the universe itself. Total scalar unity. And so again, you have figures like Spinoza who are working in this current of humanity awakening from this cataclysmic nightmare of realizing that it was functioning under an absolute dream, a theological dream being articulated by the best possible presumption that was presumed to be, which was perhaps a couple of mad monks and prophets, some of whom, the story of Moses, for instance, in the burning bush, or Heraclitus, were very, very close to the truth in terms of a thermonuclear universe, and how that implicates human behavior and the living being self. Many of whom were entirely mad with power, which is in large part the lineage and history of kings, feudal states, empires, and warlords. The awakening from this nightmare of bloodshed over principles and ideas and ideologies which are not practical and not relevant to the actual state or condition of the universe at all. And this is a terror because it destabilizes the self at the foundation of what one believes one is. It destabilizes the entire hierarchy of God, or the stories of God, which form the narratives by which people who are prescribed to ideological systems live their lives. The power structures, the national structures, the religious and political figures who are their power guide rails and guidelines. So this again goes back to Shelley's disavowal of the British state and knowledge power as an emergence of leveraging the real physical system's functions of the universe itself and what it means to know. Because to know is not simply to have an idea or to think one knows. It's to apply real principles and to observe those principles functioning in reality. This is the foundation of science. It's the foundation of experimental inquiry into being itself, through which we see everyone from Prigogine and Newton emerge. Right, the Newtonian apple case for gravity is a fantastic example of this, because this is stress testing functions of being and time. That is the foundation of science. So this failure that we are experiencing or progressively experience through modernity is an incredibly violent failure of the ontological ground collapsing out from under mankind. Again, World War I, World War II, it's a massive religious war over perceived differences that are in real time being deconstructed by the physical systems level knowledge, which culminates in the atom bomb, the Manhattan Project, the coming together of the greatest scientists in the time of the 20th century to produce a living being example of scientific power, which then utterly restructures the ideological nation states power-bound principles of global humanity, the repercussions of which we are still very clearly dealing with today. And this is what knowledge power is. And I'm not suggesting that knowledge power is purely violent. I'm suggesting that knowledge power is practical. It's a product of practical knowledge. It's not a product of belief. It's a product of real function. And of course, the atom bomb functions on the principles of stellar nuclear fusion. The creation, as was said by so many, of a sun on Earth, so to speak. So the cataclysm or catastrophe of this knowledge gap is ultimately an existential problem. It's not a problem of anything other than the perception of the human being what a human being is. What is the birth of that? What is the condition of being human? And this is precisely captured by Camus and Sartre and the existentialist tradition, which is, of course, inherited from Dostoevsky and Kierkegaard of the previous decades before the turn of the 20th century, and brought to bear in the French tradition to ask what is being human, right? And this is an attempt to synthesize at the local level, domain specifically, obviously with great failings of lack of scientific integration, the principal fragmentation of modernity, which is to say we've lost the ground of being. And predictably it ends in Camus' absurdity and Sartre's self-directed man, that man's condition is entirely based on his proclivity towards taking it and grasping it and creating with it what he will or what he may. These are all valid points at a superficial level, but they do not reach the necessary integration that is required by the scientific revolution of modernity. And this leads us back to, again, a true synthesis across disciplines, a reunion of the most intimate psychological mind, whether that's your Dostoevsky or your Kierkegaard or your Woolf, with your most cosmologically oriented, rigorous scientific practice, which is stellar and cosmological, tracing the ground of the universe and finding the thread that runs through to the most intimate psychological existential human experience, which is most typically elucidated in art. And this kind of grand pathway, whether you want to call it a nervous system pathway or a metabolic pathway, and understanding the scalar principles which function between those pathways and the stellar nuclear fusion pathways, as well as galactic formations, is the question which, again, so much of what I've mentioned and who I've mentioned here are figures of great genius, not only disciplinary genius, such as Pragogine and Darwin, but metaphysical and cosmological genius, such as Spinoza. This unification question is being passed from humanity's great minds across time in a bridge where this scaffolding is being built behind the scenes of what appears to be the massive churn and fragmentation and chaos of modernity, which is human behavior falling apart in the face of what has been built by humanity's great minds, which is a real possibility of a true ontos founded in rigorous experimentation, independent field verifiable work, which then becomes, of course, observed and absorbed as real and true, which, of course, we now know Copernicus's work today and Galileo's work today and Newton's work on gravity today to be true in a way that remains, so to speak, undefeated. And this is what shakes the ground, right? And the Copernicus story and the Copernicus realization is so telling because these are realities that are vehemently rejected at the level of the collapse, nervous system level collapse of the vision of the human being, the way of orienting oneself towards life that has been programmed deeply into the body, not only in one's own intimate lived experience, but genetically across time, intergenerationally. The human being is being radically reoriented towards truth in a way that is historically unprecedented. Historically, what was required was a cultural substratum of belief, which was a created field of narrative construct, which was a sense of community, a sense of belonging based on the stories we told about ourselves and one another, which allowed for this private silo, which was a symbolic exchange of information, which amounted to nothing more than just that, a story that was being told about life and existence, which is broken by this profound acceleration of scientific inquiry, which I am suggesting emerges from this thermonuclear thermodynamic acceleration, technological revolution, which is literally being pulled from the ground, as in fossil fuels. So we stand at the cusp of this energetic transformation with all of its effects that it's had on the ecosystem and on human consciousness with Shelley. And I linger there and I return to Shelley, because what Shelley elucidates in his very philosophy of liberation, including the treatment of human beings, regardless of if they've been classed as slaves or women or what have you, is what emerges from scientific inquiry. It's a radical, liberatory, revolutionary consciousness of what it is and what it means to be human, which observes difference only at the very thin level of small bits of genetic information and literal cell boundaries, cell borders, and cell walls, which then you can extrapolate to the living organ system and skin and nervous system of the human being, which then creates a perceptual field through which the human being digests and processes and attempts to discern truth and reality and information. It's this private chamber of the self, which is entirely reducible to the same forces and factors which function across all history and all time. A slow genetic formulation through sexual reproduction, which creates specific conditions through which the organism perceives being and to be, and what it is to be. So I think that's where I need to be with this. In this gulf, again, between religious dogma and the emergence of independent field verifiable science, is the ground upon which these existential ideological constructs shatter. And they shatter against this ground hard and violently. And these ideological constructs go to war with each other. And all the while, the scientific reality remains as it always did and as it always was, but yet is being progressively enlightened, not only in specific disciplinary silos, as we discussed, but through the incredible synthetic efforts of intelligence, which bring these fields together and present the structural reality as I've described, the operator identity behind all of these fields, which is the elucidation, it is the bringing about of the understanding of what being is, and historically what the understanding of God is. If we can see how the operator identity functions in time across all scales, we can actually discern what the identity of existence is. We understand how God moves, and thus what God is, by characterological observation of being in time. So thank you. There you go.